Welcome, everybody. My name is Ben Sosny. I am the Executive Director of the Berkshire Innovation Center. I'm here to welcome everybody tonight and then get out of the way. As many of you know, this program is put on by a group that we call the Tech Impact Forum, which is a collaboration between the Osher Lifelong Institute at Berkshire Community College, One Berkshire, and the Berkshire Innovation Center. New technologies such as big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics are having a major impact on the nature of work, labor markets, education, training, economic development, and more. This Tech Impact Forum is committed to advancing the regional understanding of the nature and potential of current and emerging technologies and how to best take advantage of them while enhancing equity in the Berkshires. This is the second in a series that we are working on focused on climate change and some of the technologies that have and are emerging as we transition to cleaner sources of energy. Many of you joined us for the first talk with Michael Berger from the Sabin Center of Columbia University and Tanya Zrebiak from Zilke Center at Williams College. Tonight, we are really grateful and honored to be joined by a host of representatives from Massdc and also our moderator tonight, Jeff Lynch from IdleSmart. I will let everybody know that our next talk will be on November 16th at 5 p.m. It will be specifically focused on the transportation sector, electrifying transportation. It's an online talk with some folks from Toyota's hydrogen fuel cell division. And I will, link to that is up on the OLLI website, and I'll also put it on our chat. Oh, there we go. So as far as the introduction to this wonderful team we have from CEC, I'm going to leave that to my friend Jeff Lynch from IdleSmart. I will say this is a really exciting collaboration for me because not only does it bring together this great organization in our state, but also with a local company. IdleSmart has an office in Lenox, Mass, who works very closely with CEC and has very familiar with their programs, and Jeff will tell you more about their relationship. I met Jeff and IdleSmart probably a month ago, and we just started working together, and it's been fantastic. IdleSmart immediately captivated me. He works primarily in the long distance trucking sector. So as most of you know, as truckers drive 14 hours a day typically and park, they more often than not leave their truck idling overnight, and that's either to keep the temperature fight the cold temperatures or fight the heat, keep their air conditioner or running or heater running or charge their devices. Jeff has a wonderful software hardware device that essentially acts like a nest for the for the cab and will so allows you to shut off the engine and turn it back on in intervals to heat up the cab and turn it off automatically, a sensory device. So it saves a tremendous amount of gas and CO2 output over, every evening. And I believe from a return standpoint, it pays for itself in about 9 months, which is really, really amazing device. So I'm sure Jeff will articulate that better than I just did, but Jeffrey, thank you for joining us. I'm really glad to have you out here in the Berkshires doing the great work you do and working with a great organization like the Massdc. So Jeff, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much. And for our friends at Massdc, thank you. Great work you guys do.
Thanks, Ben, very much. Great job. I'm not sure I could articulate it any better. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate what you and the BIC and One Berkshire and OLLI Tech Impact Forum are doing to put together which I think is a great forum here tonight. So as Ben said, my name is Jeff Lynch. I'm the founder and president of IdleSmart based here in Lenox. And I'm really excited to be here tonight with Galen Nelson and other leaders from the Mass Clean Energy Center or Massdc. The work they do is phenomenal in terms of driving growth and adoption of clean energy across the state, job creation, and also you're really being drivers of long-term economic growth for all of us. And so, they touch every aspect and every component of Massachusetts, including Berkshire County. And And I know it's not really the gist of what Galen and the team are going to talk about tonight, but understand that their work also includes investing in and providing grants to businesses that further their mission. And so IdleSmart is lucky enough and privileged enough to have been a recipient of those funds. And so aside from being thrilled to be a partner with them as we grow and scale our business, I think we're living testament to the fact that what Massdc does has a demonstrated impact in Berkshire County and all of the businesses that turn up shop here. So I have great appreciation and respect for what they do on all facets of their business. So as we mentioned in the beginning, we'll jump right in. Just housekeeping wise, if you have a question, simply use the chat feature. We will be collating and grabbing those throughout. And then when Galen and team are done speaking, I'm sure they'll provide what will be a great and rich Q&A session. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to and welcome Galen Nelson, Chief Program Officer at the Mass Clean Energy Center. Galen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I'm going to try to share some slides here. So let me get that going first. Okay, can you all see that image?
Yes.
Good, yeah. Great, wonderful. Well, thanks again, Jeff. It's really great to be with all of you tonight. I'm really happy to join with some of my wonderful colleagues here at Massdc to talk to all of you. Thank you, Ben, and to the Berkshire Innovation Center for having us. This is a really great opportunity. I would say one of the upsides of the pandemic is that with all of these virtual meetings, I think we've actually been able to have more direct communications with many more Massachusetts voters and residents from all across the state. And that's a really wonderful thing. So really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to provide a brief overview of Massdc, talk about our mission, our goals, our impact, and talk a bit about how we do our work, our tactical approaches to our economy-wide decarbonization efforts. And then, as I noted, I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleagues to go into greater detail about our efforts to decarbonize the buildings and transportation sector, our work on offshore wind, developing that important industry, and our work in the electricity sector. Let's see if I can advance the slides here. There we go. So many of you may be familiar with the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. For those of you who aren't, we are a quasi-public statewide agency focused on growing the clean energy economy here in Massachusetts and accelerating innovation across the Commonwealth to help the state meet its zero emissions goal. At a high level, we administer and design programs that drive innovation, that accelerate clean energy adoption, and build a workforce that is positioned and trained to meet the needs of the clean energy industry and our ambitious climate goals. We're very focused on reducing the cost of this massive energy transition that we need to undertake over the next 30 years through targeted investments in emerging technologies and markets, and those investments help drive down the costs of clean energy and climate solution equipment and installation costs while leveraging millions, in fact billions in private investment. We also both support and leverage the substantial and very robust clean energy innovation cluster here in Massachusetts, which of course is anchored by our Institutes of Higher Learnings and the wonderful clean energy incubators and accelerators that we have around the state. It's also important, I think, to briefly note which public policy energy related functions we don't serve at Massdc, and that is two that are, I think, particularly noteworthy. We're not a policy making body. We leave that to our wonderful colleagues at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, and we do not regulate the utilities. That responsibility lies with the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. A snapshot of our history. The Renewable Energy Trust was created under the Electric Restructuring Act in 1997. The Massachusetts Clean Energy Center itself was created by two different acts of the legislature in 2008 and 2009. Part of that involved transferring the Renewable Energy Trust to Massdc. The legislature also implemented a very small surcharge on most electricity customers' bills, which generates about $22 million annually, which supplements the trust. So that is essentially our revenue stream, our funding source. And I would just underscore there that this is something that we can really all be proud of. Massachusetts residents, through our legislative representatives, made what I think is a very smart and long-term investment in clean energy and climate well over a decade ago. And I think it's fair to say that that investment has paid off and is continuing to pay off, and positions us, I think, very well to make significant progress on the fairly daunting greenhouse gas reduction challenges that lie ahead. Along the way, we developed the Wind Technology Testing Center in Charlestown, here in Boston, where most of us are tonight, which is the largest indoor wind blade test facility in North America. And then a few years later, completed construction of the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal, which will serve as the staging ground for a good deal of the offshore wind development that we anticipate here off our shores and off New England shores. And last year, we were very happy to celebrate our 10-year anniversary. As a result of the strategic planning process and reacting to a couple of key studies that were completed by the state's Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, specifically the Clean Energy and Climate Plan and the Massachusetts Decarbonization Roadmap, we are now concentrating our efforts and our resources on 4 focus areas that you see here: high performance buildings, clean transportation, net zero grid, and offshore wind. And underlying all of those focus areas are we consider and integrate 4 themes: equity, workforce, technology development, and investments. And equity seeks to kind of address the question, how do we ensure equitable access to clean energy, including and related health and economic benefits, particularly for those residents that have been historically underrepresented. Ariel, my colleague, will talk a little bit more about our technology development programs briefly, along with her discussion of our net zero grid work. But very briefly, this involves investing in innovation that can lead to cost-effective clean energy and climate solutions, but also address greenhouse gas reduction challenges that are still unmet or not met cost-effectively with strategic investments in Massachusetts-based companies. In the interest of time, we're not going to focus too much tonight on our workforce development efforts or our investments, but I will briefly note that the Mass Clean Energy Center recently received an injection of actually 2 significant injections of funding with regard to workforce development. One is a little bit more targeted toward making investments in workforce development that will have a disproportionate impact on environmental justice communities, on women and minority-owned clean energy businesses, and on helping fossil fuel workers transition to the clean energy economy. The other is squarely focused on offshore wind workforce development efforts. And with regard to our investments, of course, that's a general term with a small I, but we have an investments arm with a capital I, you might say, where we actually make equity and venture debt investments in Massachusetts-based emerging companies. And this function is somewhat rare among state clean energy agencies. And these investments help those young Massachusetts companies grow, create jobs, and accelerate toward market impact. And we're very proud and happy to have invested in Jeff's company, in IdleSmart. I'm happy that he's here with us tonight. So sometimes it's easy to kind of become overwhelmed and perhaps even get a little depressed about the challenge that we face. And at the same time, I think it's also important to reflect on the progress that we have made over the last decade. So the image on the left shows the clean energy installations, primarily solar, in this image that we saw across the state around 2010. And now you can see the massive proliferation and expansion of clean energy, a variety of clean energy systems and equipment deployments around the state. And so working together with residences, the private sector, businesses, investors, we really can make significant progress. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, particularly as we face, again, this significantly more daunting challenge with regard to the greenhouse gas reductions we'll need to make over the coming decade, particularly as we acknowledge that the pace and scale of those reductions, those greenhouse gas reductions, really need to increase dramatically if we're to meet our interim 2030 goals. And I want you all to know that we absolutely have that challenge in mind and are laser focused on that every time we design and develop and ultimately launch programs at the Mass Clean Energy Center. I think it's also important, as Jeff noted briefly, to just touch on the sheer economic impact of the Massachusetts clean energy industry. I think you often hear about precision manufacturing or life sciences or tourism or other key industries in Massachusetts. And the clean energy industry it also has a very significant impact on our overall economy, with well over 100,000 jobs as of December 2019, around 175,000 indirect and induced jobs, nearly 40 billion of an impact on the Massachusetts gross state product. And it's also worth adding that over the last decade, the 360 million roughly that Massdc has invested in clean energy installations in companies and investments that has generated over 2 billion with a B in private and federal investment. So the opportunity for leveraged funds, as we call them, is really incredible. The overall impact, economic impact of the clean energy industry here in the state and the job creation is very significant. But back to reality and to the challenge we face. Many of you probably recognize a graph like this, a similar graph. You often see these representing the greenhouse gas reduction challenges by sector, either at the state or regional or national level or even globally. And it really does illustrate the magnitude of the challenge that we face in reducing greenhouse gas emissions across multiple sectors, essentially decarbonizing our entire economy over the next 30 years. And our interim 2030 goal is really important. And the progress that we make over the next 10 years is really critical, because hopefully, if we invest wisely and we set up the right policy frameworks, that will put us on a glide path to achieving our longer term 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals. And then of course, along the way, while we're moving through this transition, we need to make sure that we're squarely focused on and targeting our investments to ensure that our most vulnerable citizens are protected and the historically disadvantaged populations benefit from this emerging clean energy economy. And the bullets on the right there are simply meant to illustrate some of the specific sector-specific transitions that we'll need to make within the buildings sector, within the transportation sector. And I won't read them, but it's important to note that those changes represent order of magnitude increases over the current rates of adoption or rates of building retrofits or electrification that we're seeing today. So this, again, the coming decade is hypercritical and will require a massive increase in both our dedication and our investment overall. And then finally, with this, with my last slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of the how and why we approach, particularly our market development work, because I think it's probably the least understood. I think that many Massachusetts residents and businesses may have received incentives from us or from MassSave to deploy certain technologies, whether that be heat pumps or solar systems. Those are very important. They're a very important part of growing the clean energy economy. But the market development work that we undertake is a little bit more nuanced. So this is a technology or a market adoption curve, and it's a simple way to illustrate technology adoption by consumers. And this is a curve that is generally held up for a wide variety of technologies, from cell phones to laptops to solar panels to microwaves over time. And really, we see our job, our market facilitation and development work, as bridging that gap between the early adopters there that you see on the lower left and the early majority, or the fast followers, as they're sometimes called. So emerging markets, emerging technologies face a variety of adoption barriers, and our Massdc's investments in pilot projects, in public-private partnerships, in innovative business models, and other market development approaches help overcome those barriers and reduce the cost of the transition, make those options more attractive, and increase the pace of the adoption, and help kind of overcome that chasm between the early adopters and the early majority. So, for example, market development approaches might include a program to provide incentives to homeowners to electrify their space heating and cooling, and to electrify their hot water. In fact, Massdc has administered a program along those lines. It might involve helping school districts identify the right equipment and procurement pathway to shift to electric school buses. It might include a program to provide incentives to developers of affordable housing to build multifamily buildings to the very high-performing passive house design standard. Those are, in fact, all examples of market development approaches that we've actually undertaken at Massdc, again, to build market momentum, to support replicable projects, to help inform policy, and to stimulate workforce development. So if I could leave you all with anything, at least from my remarks, it would be that Massdc's market development work is extremely strategic, it's very targeted, it's timely, and it's limited. We have no intention of kind of continuing to make investments when they're no longer needed, when market momentum picks up. So that's what I've got. Hopefully that provided at least a decent overview of Massdc and a little bit about how we operate. I'm delighted that my team will get into a little bit more detail on our work in the various the focus areas that I mentioned earlier. And I believe that Peter will follow up from me with our work in the building sector. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Galen, and good evening, everybody. I'm Peter Mcphee with the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. It's great to be out here in the Berkshires tonight, enjoying the wonderful colors and apple cider and everything. So today I'm going to be talking about the built environment. Sorry, that's a joke. I'm still in suburban Boston right now, but let me just share my screen. So I'm going to be talking about the built environment and our decarbonization efforts around that. So that's something that we're all certainly familiar with our housing situations, and I think it's relatable with a lot of the bills we pay for heating and electricity. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble accessing the share screen function here, so not sure why it's not working here.
Hi, Peter. Are you able to see the green share screen button at the bottom of your screen? You should be set up.
I am. Yeah. Okay. There it goes. It was. Sorry, it's actually my fault. I apologize. I was clicking on the wrong part of the button. Okay. All right. Can you all see my screen now?
Looks good.
I apologize for that. So yeah, I'll be talking today about the built environment and our role in working to decarbonize buildings in Massachusetts. So for a little bit of background, I think we're all pretty familiar with the costs of energy in buildings. In fact, we spend about $2,500 a year on average for energy for our buildings. And that's certainly a lot of money. And it can be a true burden for many households to be able to pay that, especially during winter months when heating bills can go through the roof. So all of that energy translates to really the second largest segment of emissions in Massachusetts. So it represents 27% just what's burned in buildings, not even including the electricity that's used. If you add in electricity, it gets near 50%. And as Galen mentioned, as we approach our 2030 and 2050 targets, ultimately of net zero, we see that we certainly have a lot of work to do to reduce that 27% emissions. And the building sector is certainly very challenging to decarbonize because we have over 2 million buildings in the state. Each of those buildings has a different owner, different decision maker, different goals, and frankly, a different setup than any other building. And what's more, throughout Massachusetts, we have a very different source of fuels that we're using for heating our building and heating our water. You can see by this map, for the census blocks, they're the little squares on the map. Those in red represent areas that utilize the highest cost heating fuel, so oil, propane. And we see that a lot of those are in the more rural areas of the state, including the Berkshires, and some of the more metro areas where natural gas is available. It's a lower cost heating fuel. So we see a great discrepancy really in the costs paid geographically. And beyond that, we think about how much families and households spend on energy as a portion of their income. And now that metric's known as energy burden. So the total cost of energy you pay for in a given year divided by your household income. And if you're in a higher income family, that might be about 1 week of your annual income gets spent on energy. Median income may be about 2 weeks. If you're in a low income household, you could be spending 1 to 2 months of all of your income on energy. And that can be a real burden, especially if you're in areas where energy is more expensive. So to get to the general strategy of decarbonization in buildings, what's really emerged in the last several years is an approach to electrification as really the most cost-effective, most effective way to get towards net zero emissions goals. So what we see here is sort of for a model home, what the emissions are for a house heated by oil, natural gas, and heat pumps today in 2020 or 2021. And we see that for oil house, it might be 8 or 9 tons of emissions per year. Natural gas, if you just count what's burned on site, it's a little bit over 6. A heat pump today, air source heat pump emits about 4 tons of emissions per year when you incorporate the electricity emissions, and a ground source heat pump even less. Fast forward though to 2050, and what we see as our electricity gets cleaner and cleaner, we see that oil and natural gas emissions really stay the same, though we may be able to make improvements to their efficiency or to the envelope of the building. So here we've assumed you can make some of those, but you still have significant emissions with the building. But for heat pumps, we see as electricity becomes 100% clean, those emissions essentially go to zero. And that's known as beneficial or strategic electrification, which is sort of a fundamental concept for buildings and transportation as well, how to hit a net zero target as the state's obligated to do. And ultimately, this translates to what we're considering the high efficiency electric home of 2025. So this is a building that has all electric appliances, heating and cooling, essentially electric vehicle charging station. They may or may not have solar panels on the roof, but that's essentially what the solution looks like when it's taken down to the ground level of an actual building. So what are the directives that are driving Massdc's work in buildings? So a lot's happened in the last year or two. We see first off, a big study that was completed at the end of 2020 was the 2050 roadmap, essentially looking at what's needed to get the Commonwealth to net zero emissions by 2050. And what I have here on the left side of the slide are some of the primary takeaways of that. So essentially that electrification of end use heating and water heating in a building is the lowest risk and most cost-effective decarbonization strategy for most buildings. And that investments and envelope efficiency, so the insulation and air sealing, have a significant benefit for lowering costs of that. There may be some applications for decarbonized fuels, but they're more likely limited, and natural gas for heating must decline in the near term. And some implications of that are that there's really a need to capitalize on replacement opportunities for technology. So when your boiler gets to the end of life, that's the most cost-effective time to replace it with a heat pump, for example. Or if you're renovating your house, that's the best time to insulate it. But also that we should be ensuring that buildings built today will be compliant with emissions requirements by 2050. Another important piece of policy that came out was the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2030, which is the implementation side for the Global Warming Solutions Act. And it established the need for a high efficiency energy code, for making some changes to mass save to really start to pull back on fossil fuel incentives, focus more on electrification, and push more for equitable adoption in low and moderate income communities. And to establish as well a declining cap on heating fuel emissions. And this is a significant portion of the driver here for building decarbonization. And the proposal from the governor was that by 2030, 1 million homes should be electrified for their heating to meet our greenhouse gas emissions requirements, as well as 350 million square feet of commercial space. In parallel with this, the DPU is running a process in the future of gas to identify what role natural gas utilities have in a decarbonized Massachusetts and how they can operate within those constraints. And what are the alternatives to natural gas? Some could be geo microdistricts, biofuels, synthetic fuels, other things, nothing. It really depends. And that's something that'll be coming out in the next several months that will be informing some of these directions going forward. As well, in the city of Boston, not too long ago, a month or so ago, they passed an ordinance that required declining emissions within all of their buildings. So what we see here, it's a little bit tricky to see, but for different building typologies in the city, reducing the emissions from those buildings as they get towards 2050, which is a significant action in addition to statewide, but also having on the city level. So some of the key trends that we've been seeing in buildings, certainly electrification, and that's scaling up. We've been working in this space for about 10 years now, but we've seen in the last year or two this really take off as a sort of keystone strategy towards decarbonizing buildings. And we can see here from 2020 to 2050, some of the shift from fossil fuels towards electricity, going in parallel with increasing clean electricity supply across the state. And this little cartoon here on the right is from the 2050 roadmap, sort of showing what life could look like in 30 years, where most homes are electric and efficient, using heat pumps for heating and cooling. We also see, as I mentioned, trying to take advantage of stock turnover. So we think about like light bulbs lasting maybe 5 years or 7 years nowadays, and it used to be much shorter, but there's a very frequent replacement. Even for vehicles, they get replaced somewhat regularly. But when we talk about buildings, a lot of these have lifespans of even over 100 years. The appliances within them and the furnaces and boilers can be 15, 20, 25 years. So decisions that we're making today have implications for decades to come. And when we think about these declining emissions towards 2050, it's important to take into account how long the decisions that you're making today will be in existence for, and how many opportunities we have to make those changes in buildings the most cost-effective way. And then I think what we'll talk about a lot today is the need to ensure that we're getting equitable adoption of clean energy technologies across the state, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also it's necessary for us to achieve our greenhouse gas emissions goals. And I think we also see a need for expanding workforce in this space and ensuring that when we're making these changes, that it's really transitioning to a thriving economy in the state and offering opportunities for workforce development. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is sort of our strategy and some of the programs that we have out on the street today. So essentially Massdc, we're not Mass Save, we're not a regulatory agency. We're here to demonstrate and prove out a lot of the solutions that are needed to make this transition. So we're essentially in the buildings team trying to build out the solutions that will be available for broad scaling by 2025. So we're working to, number one, generate the solutions, prove out those solutions, and ultimately bring those solutions to market. And we're really focused on some of the most critical, unaddressed, and time-sensitive barriers to doing that in the building space. So what's that translate to for programs? So our Decarbonization Pathways program is looking at existing small residential buildings, and what are the models that we can take a leaky fossil fuel-based building today that's expensive to heat and has high emissions, and transition that over time as the decisions are made to replace boilers and water heaters and other systems within the house in order to arrive at a building that's 2050 ready. And we're launching this program to test this out for 75 to 100 homes and develop plans and implementation for 30 of those homes. For our Building Electrification and Transformation Accelerator, that's BETA, we have a program focused on triple deckers, which are predominant throughout the state, including in parts of Western Mass. Similar approach of how can we take these old buildings that have served a great purpose of housing and affordable housing over the decades and centuries and make them a building that can operate efficiently and cost effectively. And what we have here is a picture of an example building that has been proposed for upgrading that to a high performance building. We're doing similar work on commercial buildings in conjunction with the city of Boston in order to develop plans for large commercial buildings to transition towards high efficiency and electric technologies and working with the city to provide resources to support the industry in doing that. Our Liabilities to Assets program takes single family homes that have been foreclosed and often have come into rundown condition and working with the state's Department of Housing and Community Development to take those homes, rehabilitate them in a way that will be 2050 ready with a high performance building envelope and all electric systems so that it will be operating at a low cost and efficient and also be able to serve housing for lower income families when they're completed. Our Empower program is focused on environmental justice communities and working with local community organizations to bring the outreach and engagement with households to implement cost-saving clean energy solutions in those communities. So that's a program that a lot of these programs we're launching this fall and early winter, and we're excited to see how they can be solving some of these critical problems. And our last program I wanted to mention today is Clean Energy Lives Here. And essentially, this is a resource available to all residents in Massachusetts through our website that works to engage with consumers and provide resources to inform decision-making for how to move from your current home when making decisions to make decisions that will be consistent with a higher performance home and a lower carbon emissions home. So how do you make the decisions? How do you evaluate what's out there? How do you engage with industry to implement that? So it's a website that we supported, and it's at massdc.com/go-clean. And there's resources for everything from how to look for heat pumps and what heat pumps might be appropriate for your home, water heating, induction stoves, high performance dryers, for example, how to insulate your home and so on, and how to engage with existing resources through Mass Save or elsewhere that can help support you getting there. So with that, I will wrap up my presentation. Here's my contact information, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Can you all see the slides?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Great. So I'm Rachel Ackerman, the Director of Transportation for Massdc. I'll be presenting on clean transportation today. So as Galen highlighted at the beginning of this discussion, transportation is one of the key areas that needs focus on the state because it's very high emissions. It's about 42% of all greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the transportation sector within the state. We have not seen a significant decline within this sector since focusing on this topic area. And so you probably have seen recent initiatives coming out of state agencies as well as Massdc to focus in this particular sector, which has definitely been brought into the fold in terms of thinking about the clean energy sector in Massachusetts. I have a further breakout here that just shows some subsets within the transportation sector. So oftentimes light duty trucks are looped into the passenger cars. It's more of like an F-150, a traditional more passenger style truck. So that takes up, over 50% of the emissions. So that's just focusing on passenger cars, working with dealerships. And then the heavy duty vehicles and medium duty vehicles, that makes an additional 26%. So again, these are vehicles that are on the road and that we can actively target right now. Massdc has also been doing some initiatives in the aviation sector, and the other 8% is more like marine and train and other very large scale vehicles within the state. We focus on these a little bit more under our technology development group versus in our market development group, which is the sector that I work within, just because the scale of funding needed for aviation and other is much larger than many entities can help move the needle on. Within the passenger light duty trucks and heavy duty vehicles, we have several initiatives that are currently moving forward. One of them is actually ongoing is our Accelerating Clean Transportation Now. This is our first large scale funding in the transportation sector with over $1 million in budget. Provided essentially leveraging funding to get some private and public partnerships to demonstrate innovative either business models or financing models in order to deploy technologies. So some examples would be, we have a income tiered EV car share program in Roxbury, which is an environmental justice community. If you qualify for lower moderate income, you pay a lower price. If you do not qualify, if you're sort of moderate or high income, you pay sort of that standard rate for that car share service. Those cars are electric vehicles. We're helping to install charging stations at community housing developments. There's also some located near MBTA stations and some of the universities nearby. So there's several hubs for them to access for this income tiered EV car sharing program. We're also working with Plug in America to do some dealer training. So we are very aware that education on the dealer side is needed in order to be selling EVs. If you go to a dealer and you're interested in purchasing, that's one of the larger barriers. If you feel like your dealer is not able to provide you with accurate information, it feels a little bit like it's a larger step for you to take than if they're to prepare you with all the information you need to make an educated decision for what type of vehicle you're purchasing. And also we're hoping that would incentivize them to be able to sell more vehicles and more EVs, and therefore request more EVs to be on their lots and available within the Commonwealth. We definitely see a little bit of a shortage in the secondhand EV market. So the more that we can get EVs in the hands of owners or leases and get those sort of recurring and back into the market stream, so they are available for others in the future that may not be at a place where they can purchase a brand new vehicle up front. We had a very strong showing in terms of applications on the bus electrification side. We're working with the MBTA to help demonstrate the effectiveness of doing upfront planning for their depot to go electric in Quincy. And so that's a very large scale diesel bus fleet, again, located in an environmental justice community with large particulate matter emissions. And so as they think about electrifying that fleet, they need to think about the depot design to support that electrification process. And so we're involved to help identify ways to streamline that process and to also identify sort of what the cost savings are from different modeling techniques that can be used for that. And that way that can be shared with other MBTA projects, regional transit authorities, and perhaps even smaller fleets across Massachusetts. We have 3 school bus projects happening right now. They're in different school districts and they have different ownership models. I like to say our team has learned a lot about the nuances for school districts and town purchasing and procurement laws through this. It's making it a little bit of a struggle and a challenge. So this is an area where we are helping to identify the purchase or a third-party ownership or bus as a electrification, which is where a third party comes in and provides the bus and electrification services, and the school just pays a monthly bill for that. So looking at these 3 different business models and how they work and what the financing structure is. And in addition to taking these learnings and then spreading it out to other schools across the Commonwealth, 2 of the projects are looking to do group procurement within their regions. And so thinking about that economies of scale as school districts can come together to perhaps put in purchasing or learn about other economies of scale that they can take advantage of as the schools can move forward at the same time. We're hoping to do some additional follow-on work with the school bus electrification, just realizing that there is a large amount of services and information that needs to be provided to schools in order for them to make those informed decisions. And so we're hoping to pull together some additional takeaways beyond those planned for those existing projects to share across Massachusetts. There's a large number of projects here. We got a great number of applications from this. And so you'll see later on, we have another follow-on program we're about to make awards for in a very similar style. But again, all of these are pilot projects and just demonstrating that this model can work and going to be sharing those lessons learned so that it won't necessarily take additional funding for these projects to happen in other parts of the state. Or if it does, those particular state agencies who provide rebates and other funding are more knowledgeable about how they should be spending their money in a wise way across the state. A little bit of a separate program is this fleet advisory program. So similar to the school bus electrification and the MBTA Quincy depot electrification, we realized that thinking about a charging station and this depot build out and finding the right vehicle for your fleet can be very difficult. National Grid is running a fleet advisory program for public fleets right now within their service territory. But public fleets often have a little bit more of a resource in terms of having a fleet manager and a larger scale fleet sometimes. And so we wanted to look at it from the private side in order to provide this information back to the utilities or other entities who are interested in doing fleet advisory in the Commonwealth at a much larger scale. And so we are about to make an award to a consultant to provide this service within this month. With the services being available by the beginning of 2022, we're going to do a sort of a high level overview for about 50 fleets, looking at what vehicles they have, what routes they drive, what kind of sites they're located on, where their fleets are parked overnight, and provide just sort of a high level report in terms of like, here's the information you would need in order to move forward with an electrification of your fleet. Here's some examples of vehicles you could move over to. Here's a general range in terms of financial costs. Again, a high level, more information. Some of these fleets may or may not be able to move forward at that time because of having financing in place. Maybe their vehicles are not ready to be retired at that time. It doesn't make financial sense for them to make that retirement in this exact moment. And so that information will be there. And will still be up to date for them when they do decide to move forward. For the fleets that are able and are in the right place to move forward, we'll do an even more detailed analysis that focuses on the charging station and that financing model for them, thinking about upfront costs and leasing and financing and procurement. And so about 10 to 15 fleets will get that much more detailed analysis and hand-holding to really identify what are the specific models we're going to purchase, where are the charging stations going to be located, and getting a lot more information in terms of making that decision to purchase. And those fleets who are actually able to put in a purchase order at the time will provide support all the way through commissioning, mechanic and driver training for employees that currently are servicing their fleets. The aim of this is also to help fleets take advantage of the existing more EV truck funding, which is a rebate that the state is providing for vehicles that are class 2B, which is like an F-250, and larger all the way up through heavy duty vehicles. For example, school buses qualify for that, as well as other heavy duty vehicles. And so this will hopefully be a great service for all of the fleets in Massachusetts. we're looking for size fleets of 3 vehicles or larger. One of those vehicles does have to qualify for that More EV Truck rebate program, so a Class 2B or larger. The other vehicles can be like a sedan or a smaller vehicle, knowing that there is usually a mix of vehicles in a fleet. We're also looking for fleets that are have minority ownership, are located in environmental justice communities. We definitely realize that there is a need to help those areas that have essentially an overburden from the pollution coming from vehicles. So for example, if you have a fleet operating in a community and it's a diesel fleet, it's a great way to support your community by electrifying, because you'll be reducing the emissions that are going into that community. So this is, again, set to launch shortly, and they're going to be developing all of the program materials to help support those fleets. And they'll be available for fleets in very early 2022. So please be in touch if you have fleets that you're interested in taking advantage of this program. And then back to my first point on the Act Now program, a little bit of a follow-up in terms of the template. Accelerating Clean Transportation for All is a little bit of a spin on the Act Now program, with a much stronger focus on supporting communities that are either overburdened by greenhouse gas emissions and transportation, or they are underserved in terms of them not having the right transportation resources that they need to sort of go about their daily lives, have access to jobs, have access to grocery stores. And so this focused much more heavily on those impacted communities with a slightly larger dollar value. It was intended to inform further state programming. So all these are identified more as a pilot scale. So the state will hopefully be able to inform additional funding going towards these, or additional resources to help support the growth within these industries. The topic areas that we were looking for applications under were e-bike pilot incentive programs, which focuses a little bit more on that vehicle mile traveled reduction, and also for giving a vehicle to people in a priority population who may not be able to purchase a new vehicle. So this is a nice in between step until we have much more of a strong secondhand electric vehicle fleet that is at a price point of $3,000 to $8,000. Right now, there's still about that $15,000 range for a secondhand electric vehicle. Another topic area was vehicles for hire, which is like an Uber, a Lyft, taxi, and car sharing pilot incentive programs. So none of these tend to be high mileage vehicles. They do sometimes tend to operate in an area where there can be high emissions. So really trying to target these. And they also have the added benefit of being very visible vehicles. And so you can sort of take a ride in them. They get a lot of exposure into a community with just one vehicle. So it's a great vehicle to change over to electric, because you kind of get that automatic marketing from it. Then broaden the base of electric vehicle consumers. I think we all sort of see, the traditional sort of first mover consumer is like an older white male. And so thinking about how do we change who is purchasing an electric vehicle? Is it a minority? Is it a woman? Is it somebody who is not high income? And so working through either education, sales, or financing models sort of change that diversity and representation within EV drivers in the state. And then finally, this is a fancy name for essentially thinking about like an urban delivery fleet is one example, a high mileage, low radius fleet. So again, very high impact, kind of what I mentioned on the fleet advisory services in terms of, looking to change over how you impact the community you operate in. So really trying to target those diesel vehicles and other emitting vehicles, and how we change those over to electric, whether it's first last mile delivery services, short haul fleets, any of those sort of have a very high impact in a small area. Again, a lot of these do tend to have depots in environmental justice or high GHG emissions areas. And so having examples of all of these types of projects is a great way for the state to then identify what are the actual emissions reductions coming from projects within these sectors. What type of incentive value does it really take for someone to adopt these technologies, and for a private organization or a nonprofit to really move the needle in one of these particular sectors. I do want to say for all the applications that we received, we were very excited to see that a lot of them had very strong community-based organization partnerships. That was very important for us to outline in this program, because we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just like a private company thing and hey, you should do this and it's going to be great. We wanted to make sure the community was really bought into this, and that the people being impacted in these communities were really partners in these projects as well. So they can identify not only what was the highest priority in their community, but then they can also be the ones to help market whatever the solution is. So for example, having an e-bike and helping to get the word out there for who really needs to take advantage of these services in terms of the needs of their community. And so that's something that we are working on at Massdc in terms of identifying what's the best way to really prioritize that within our funding and help identify the right project partners to make sure that not just the proposal coming to us is informed, but the actual implementation of it. And finally, I just want to make note of a new program we're launching right now. It's sort of a revamp of one we did for energy storage, and we're sort of upping for energy storage, is training for first responders. So for example, firefighters, to respond to energy storage and electric vehicles if there is some kind of accident at a site that has one of these. So if you have a home house fire, and you happen to have a Tesla Powerwall. So let's say, you know, it's winter, you're having your stove going and something happens. We want the firefighters in that area to sort of know if you had that Tesla Powerwall, what if the fire gets to that area, what should they be doing? And so the National Fire Protection Association provides fantastic trainings, and we're paying for those trainings so that firefighters can receive this for free. It also covers electric vehicle crash responses as well. So we're reaching out to all the fire chiefs across Massachusetts to make sure that their fire stations are aware of this training program. Again, I think all of our work around this, you know, market facilitation is just making sure that people have the right information out there to make educated decisions and sort of integrate these technologies into the communities. And safety is obviously a very important part of integrating that into the community. I'll close it off there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Bruce Carlisle, Managing Director for Offshore Wind with Massdc. Can you all see my slides?
You look great, yep.
Oh, great, excellent. I've got half an eye on the clock here. I know we want to leave some time for panel discussion. So I'm going to try to move quickly through my slides because I know Ariel is going to be talking about net zero grid next, and we do want to have some discussion. And I know some folks have been keeping up with the chat. I have not been able to, so we'll have to wait for those to come in the panel. Let's see here. Why? This is the same thing that's happening. Okay, that's how we'll be advancing tonight. Yeah. So did I? No, there we go. Okay. Offshore wind. So I hope everybody has heard of offshore wind and its future for not only for the Commonwealth, but for the region and really for the U.S. as a key renewable source of energy, especially on our coasts where the resource, the significant indigenous resource, is very close to load, what we call demand, and the concentrations of our urban centers on the coast. In Massachusetts, as with other states, offshore wind is going to be an essential generation component of our decarbonization roadmap. And you can see here on the top of this slide, based on very extensive modeling and pathway studies for the Commonwealth in our 2050 roadmap. The estimates are, on the order of more than 15 gigawatts installed over the next 30 years. So all the buildings that Peter was talking about, and the EVs that Rachel was talking about, a good majority of them will be powered by the resource off in our coastal waters. I won't read through the rest of this, only to say that there's a lot of other really important features which make it offshore wind a really good fit for Massachusetts, and as I keep saying, for other states and for the region. And a really important element here is this truly is a new industry. And with that comes both economic impact, but also workforce impact. And you can see some of the numbers from our friends at the American Wind Energy Association here. So really multiple benefits, and something that we are actively working on here in the Commonwealth. Offshore wind has been a core focus area for Massdc since our inception. As Galen articulated, we work with other partners, both in state government, in terms of our colleagues at the Department of Energy Resources, who are leading the procurements and largely developing the policy, colleagues at the Office of Coastal Zone Management and Marine Fisheries, who are very involved in wind energy siting and permitting and obviously responsible development and avoiding and minimizing impact. At Massdc, these are really the three focus areas for us: planning, analysis, and engagement, sector development, which includes ports, supply chain, and workforce, and research and innovation. And I'll provide a few examples on sector development and research innovation in my slides. Massachusetts was out in front and continues to be out in front, but our sort of early foray was sort of cemented in 2016 when the governor signed the first bill authorizing the competitive procurement of cost-effective offshore wind. The bill was signed in 2016, and it created the first state goal of 1.6 gigawatts or 1,600 megawatts. In 2017, our colleagues at Energy Resources with the utilities or the electric distribution companies, as we call them, issued the first RFP. And in May of 2018, Vineyard Wind, which is a joint venture between Avangrid and Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, won the state's first competitive bid at prices which I think really surprised almost everyone who's been tracking the industry and had previously seen sort of Cape Wind prices. Vineyard Wind is now poised to literally begin its onshore construction in the coming weeks and months, and really has been through probably the better part of 7 or 8 years in its permitting, environmental reviews, and project development. Hit some delays during the sort of previous administration as they were sort of focused in on understanding cumulative impacts and other factors. But with the Biden administration and their very, very swift action on offshore wind, setting a new national goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030, we're back on track here with offshore wind industry, and really looking forward to supporting Vineyard Wind as they move into their construction and installation of the first commercial scale offshore wind project in the United States. Right behind them are a few other projects in the region, Rhode Island and in New York. And then our second project in Massachusetts, Mayflower Wind, which it's also a joint venture between Shell Renewable Energies and ocean winds, was selected in the second Massachusetts procurement. Our third procurement is actually in process as we speak. Bids were submitted in September, and selection is going to be made, as we understand it, in December, and really looking forward to the results of that procurement. One other note here is that the state's authorization increased in this year with the passage of the 2021 climate bill, bringing us to a total authorization of 5.6 gigawatts. So in Massachusetts and with Massdc, these are some of the sort of the principles that drive our work in offshore wind. I won't read them, but these are really sort of important across the multiple areas in which we work. I mentioned sector development. So on ports and infrastructure, Galen included the New Medford Marine Commerce Terminal in one of his slides, but two facilities that Massdc owns and operates and that we designed and constructed is right now the nation's only purpose built offshore wind marshaling or staging and pre-assembly port in the US. In the port of New Bedford is a 30-acre heavy lift facility. And we've also done studies that show the industry and other partners the other potential sites on the waterfront that are available to the industry. There's been some recent news. The governor committed an additional $100 million to leverage private investments in ports. And there was a recent announcement with Vineyard Wind, the city of Salem and the former coal-fired power plant site up in Salem being repurposed for offshore wind as well. So looking forward to seeing the progress on those fronts. The development of a local supply chain is going to be critically important with the US industrialization for offshore wind. For the first several projects, the components that make up these offshore wind turbines, the towers and nacelles, the blades, the foundations, a lot of the cabling is manufactured overseas, for the most part in Europe, although there are some other locations in Asia. All that manufacturing will begin to be located in the US. There is now sufficient pipeline and visibility into the market that we're starting to see some of those decisions and announcements being made, which is why we need to start now to connect up our local suppliers and service providers with the industry. And you can see on this slide some of the efforts that Massdc does to do just that. The other really important area in which we've been working, really concentrated our activity over the last several years, is in developing the offshore wind workforce. So in Massachusetts, we've got a very, very strong maritime workforce, marine construction. We've got some very qualified, skilled trades, electricians, equipment operators, and others. We are going to need to grow those occupations. We're going to need to recruit and develop pathways, especially as Galen was talking about, for those who have not had equitable access to employment opportunities. As we do this, we've started at Massdc and over the last 3 years have made some early investments in some of the introductory courses, in some of the really important health and safety training, and in some of the technical and higher education programs. And you can see over here on the right-hand slide some of the recipients and some of the partners and programs that are forming a core ecosystem for offshore wind workforce here in the Commonwealth, really putting Massachusetts out in front for the nation on this matter. Research and innovation is a really important aspect of sort of Massdc and our efforts, and that extends into offshore wind. And this is something where I expect to see more and more involvement and investment in the coming years. One of our important areas here is our participation as a board member and a resource for the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. So this is a U.S. Department of Energy led initiative now hosted in New York with sort of partnership with NYSERDA, but with now the participation of several other states, including Massachusetts, along with developers, the turbine manufacturers and other tier one industry leads who are essentially developing the research and development and innovation roadmap to lower costs and increase innovation in this space. So this is a really important partnership for us. And the other example here are going to be these opportunities working with industry and with both some of the early technology startups and looking for commercialization opportunities for offshore wind. A great partnership with Greentown Labs and Vineyard Wind and Massdc, pioneering technologies that would essentially result in real-time data and information to reduce potential interactions with marine mammals, with a focus especially on the North Atlantic right whale. And you can see some of the companies over here on the left-hand side, and I won't spend much more time on each one of these. And just quickly to sort of highlight where we're going, we're going to continue to expand our efforts in workforce. We're going to be doing the same with supply chain, working directly with some leading suppliers and service providers, connecting them up with the offshore wind developing companies and the wind turbine manufacturers to make sure that they have the right traits and capabilities in order to compete for contracts. We'll be investing in some early work to help these companies after they've been through this capability assessment to develop the resources, business plans, health and safety plans, retooling and trainings in order to compete, and continuing our work with, in particular, efforts to begin siting and commercial leasing in the Gulf of Maine. So I think that might be the end of my slides, and it is, and I will pass it over to Ariel for Net Zero Grid.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Let me put up my slides. Hopefully everyone can see these.
Looks good.
And is audio okay?
Sound good, yep.
All right, excellent. So hi everyone, my name is Ariel Horowitz. I'm a senior program director at the Mass Clean Energy Center focused on our work around net zero grid and technology innovation as well. And I'll just cap out the presentations with a little bit on these two topics around sort of the electric grid and how we encourage innovation generally. So as my colleagues have been talking about, the keys to deep decarbonization, not just for Massachusetts, but really this has been found repeatedly in deep decarbonization studies for many different jurisdictions, really focus on making the energy services that we use as efficient as possible. So when I say energy services, that generally means your hot shower and your cold beer. Generally, people don't really care how the beer gets cold, how the shower gets hot, just that happens, on time and appropriately. So we want to make that process as efficient as we possibly can. And then we want to run everything that we can on electricity because we think that we have a solid path to fueling that electricity with clean energy or carbon-free energy, sort of as Bruce was just talking about. And here you can see I've kind of sorted our focus areas into these strategic buckets. The Commonwealth's interim clean energy and climate plan for 2030 goes through by sector what the different steps are that the Commonwealth needs to take to accomplish these different goals. And as you can see here in strategy E6, one of the big things that we need to do to get to where we're looking to get in 2030 is to upgrade the grid to enable the additions of clean energy and of electrification loads, so heat pumps and electric vehicles, most notably, to get to the resource set that's going to fuel our economy without producing carbon dioxide. The problem that we have is something that was recently covered in an A1 article in the New York Times a couple of days ago, that the grid across the whole country is pretty old. So we built out most of the electric grid starting around 100 years ago. And really what's fueled the design and growth of the electric grid has been a design schema that's focused on putting large centralized fossil-fired power plants almost anywhere that you want to put them. Sometimes they need access to sort of cooling water, but by and large, you have a lot of discretion over where these power plants go, and then importing power from power plants to load centers like Springfield, Worcester, Boston, areas that are really dense in terms of the energy usage. As we think about upgrading the grid to get to where we need to get for 2030 and 2050, we have a couple of different issues in front of us. One is that the equipment is really sized for sort of the amount of electricity that a house or a commercial building, for example, may have used if it's heated by oil and doesn't have an electric car associated with it. And if you start adding a lot of electrification load, then you start adding a lot more sort of traffic through the wires that they're not necessarily designed to handle. And the same thing is true if you start adding rooftop solar, then you can really decrease the traffic on the lines beyond what they're sort of designed to be supporting, which can lead to other sorts of reliability and other issues. And then finally, when we think about integrating large amounts of renewable energy, as much as we would love to be able to kind of plonk the offshore wind exactly where we want it so that it's convenient for the transmission lines, the wind is only blowing where it blows offshore, and we have to figure out how to build the lines that are going to import that wind from the coastline again into our load centers. So when we think about a grid that can support a net zero economy, we need a system that can deliver electricity to end use customers, but also sort of easily accommodate these new resources and new resource types that we're talking about, enable this large scale electrification of transportation and heating, enable customers to sort of shape their load and change how they're using electricity in response to the availability of renewable energy. So, when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, and to enable that to happen without real disruption to the availability of energy services. And of course, we would also love to keep the lights on during major storms and other sorts of threats to grid reliability. The grid does not do all of those things today. And so that's the set of upgrades that we would really like to see in terms of the abilities of the electric grid. This is a highly regulated space. There's a lot of different players at the table. So most notably, the electric grid is owned and operated in New England by electric utilities. The investor-owned electric utilities in Massachusetts are Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil. And then some of you may also live in municipal lighting plant territory as well, where it's your local town who owns and operates the distribution grid. The utilities also report up to a state regulator called the Department of Public Utilities. And then there's a range of different market participants as well that kind of interact with the electric utilities that we try to facilitate. And of course, most importantly in this system is electric ratepayers, or the customers who are needing these energy services and will be increasingly needing energy services fueled by electricity. So our three big problem areas for a net zero grid, again, are really to facilitate integrating renewable energy to get to this zero carbon or very low carbon generation fleet, to enable electric load or the use of electricity to be flexible, and to facilitate and make it cheaper to electrify everything, serve all of our energy services. And then ideally to use clean distributed generation to increase the resiliency of the grid to any kind of threat or vulnerability condition. One area where we're really concentrating right now is on this question of planning for electrifying everything. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of peak load, which is the single hour of the year when customers in New England are using the most electricity of any given hour. And it turns out that our whole electric grid is sized for that 1 hour of the year. So all year long, we're paying costs that are associated with one single hour. And a lot of the energy of the electric system really goes into predicting that hour, controlling that hour, and so forth. As we historically, that the being able to predict when peak load is and sort of what the characteristic of peak load is has been relatively easy, because it's really associated with some pretty predictable conditions, or was until pretty recently. So usually the peak load hour would be a really hot, humid summer day, right sort of towards the late afternoon when people are really ramping up their air conditioning and they're also turning on a bunch of lights. As our especially our lighting has become more efficient. I'm sure most of you own LED light bulbs at this point. And as a bunch of people have started installing rooftop solar, and as we start having more electric vehicles added to the grid, as we start adding more heat pumps to the grid, the timing of that 1 hour and the sort of the conditions that cause it are going to keep shifting. So that hour has already sort of started moving later in the day due to rooftop solar. And we're going to see, heat pumps start contributing to certain types of peaks, maybe in the winter, which would be a big change for us. We're going to see electric vehicles start contributing to peaks. And if we want to control the costs associated with this transition, we're really going to need to be able to predict what's going on, have some amount of control and communication with different devices, have a much smarter grid that can respond to these types of conditions. And we're also going to need to do some upgrades to accommodate the types of resources that we're going to add. And we don't really have a very detailed sense of what those costs are going to be. So we've started an effort called the Net Zero Grid Distribution Planning Lab, where we're working with Eversource and National Grid, as well as with a couple of startup companies and one other entity that we're still sort of contracting with, to start thinking about, how do we change the way that we are planning the electric grid to really enable a graceful, rapid transition without a lot of cost burden for ratepayers, and take this really legacy system and move it towards a future where it's going to be really the backbone of all of our energy services. So I just wanted to spend a couple of slides also talking about general innovation. A couple of companies that I mentioned on the last slide are startups, and we do work with startups pretty frequently. We do a lot of work supporting technology development and the clean technology ecosystem in the Commonwealth. We have two different sides of this work. We do direct support to innovators through a suite of different grant programs. We also support what we call ecosystem partners, so startup incubators and startup accelerators as well. And you can see kind of the two different approaches in this Venn diagram here. And then this slide just goes over kind of the different approaches that we take. So we think a lot about really trying to support innovators through everything from kind of the research and development stage up through to commercialization, with a range of different kind of award sizes and approaches to whether we're talking about an investment or a grant or cost share. we try to really meet innovators where they're at and bridge their gap from kind of an idea towards the commercialization. So we're always happy to talk to folks with new ideas, and we know that we're going to need a lot of innovation to get to 2050, and we want Massachusetts to continue to be, you know, a national and really global leader in clean technology innovation, and we're proud to keep fostering that along. So with that, I think that was my last slide, and I will yield back to kick off the Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Ariel. I appreciate that. I know we're a little short of time, and Galen and team have done a great job answering questions on the chat feature. And so what I was thinking is this, Galen, maybe directly to you, or you can hand off to your team, but, you know, sort of maybe two closing questions. We've covered a lot of territory. I guess one question would be, you know, what's interesting that you and your team see out there that maybe you didn't cover that's maybe emerging or in front of us? And then as a close, what's the one thing you'd want to leave this group with after tonight's presentation?
Wow, I will invite my colleagues to weigh in on that. But honestly, I think as much as it's my instinct is to kind of talk about technologies or emerging markets, and that's all important. I actually think that we have a serious kind of marketing and consumer education challenge ahead of us. And I think we need a lot more innovation there. I think we need to reach a lot more people and shift the focus from kind of doom scrolling and being upset about climate, which is certainly a natural instinct. I have my days, but focus more on what are you doing in your home? What are you doing in your business? Have you talked to your neighbor about climate? Have you signed up for Peter's Clean Energy Lives Here campaign? What steps are you taking to decarbonize your home or your business? And then talk to your legislator about the same. What are they doing from a policy perspective to strengthen the state's already very strong position? So I think we need a much smarter and more strategic and harder hitting marketing effort, to be honest, around helping the state's, again, residential and business energy consumers move to a cleaner future. I forgot the second question.
Well, it was one thing that you leave us with, and then trends you see in front of us that maybe you didn't talk about that maybe are emerging.
Well, I'll pass the trends question to other colleagues. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
My guess is dinner is trending for a lot of people.
I'll just add, I mean, I think a lot of the solutions we've talked about do, you know, from the household side and transportation side, do offer a lot of benefits that we don't have with our current systems. I mean, anybody who's driven an EV understands that there are amazing technology, and things like heat pumps and building improvements can add to comfort in your home, quality of life, improved air quality. So there's a lot of real positives that can occur with these transitions. And I think from a resident point of view, thinking about like when you make your purchasing decisions, taking into account some of the newer technologies and improvements that are available can be beneficial for your personal life as well as for the climate, and oftentimes for your pocketbook as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think especially like as we start electrifying our vehicle fleet, once we have a really significant percentage of the vehicles on the road being electric, I think people will start realizing, you know, how quiet those vehicles are, how much better the air quality is outside. One thing we've learned in the pandemic is, you know, air quality is really important. Take care of your lungs. And that's, yeah. So even though a lot of this work is motivated through climate change, it's going to deliver a lot of quality of life benefits as well.
I'll just jump in here real quick and say, you know, well, offshore wind is, yes, it's a coastal and ocean thing, and it's off to the east of even, you know, Boston and our coastal cities and towns. We really want to see the benefits extend all the way out to, you know, to Western Massachusetts. And there are going to be both companies and businesses, as well as innovators and new technologies, and people who are going to join our workforce, whether that's, you know, working, you know, on the actual turbines and you know, technical side of things or helping us with, biological surveys and engineering. This is an all of Massachusetts endeavor, and just want to sort of raise that for your constituents out here.
Yeah, great point, Bruce. Great. I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. I'll start by thanking you, Galen, Peter, Ariel, Rachel, and Bruce for your great overview, and also just working through the questions as have come in. Thank everybody for participating and joining. I hope everybody learned something about just the scope and reach and just, again, what amazing work the Massdc is doing on behalf of all of us here in Massachusetts. Last reminder that electrifying transportation through OLLI on November 16th. And again, thanks to Ben and the BIC, One Berkshire and OLLI for helping us put this together. So with that, we will sign off. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. And again, thanks to Galen, to you and your team for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Happy to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. And thanks team at OLLI and Massdc. You guys are fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Good night, all.
Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.
I'm very sorry that we didn't have as much time for questions, but
That's okay. No, they
did a great
did
job in the chat. So
yeah, and I think everybody did a great job in chat. So I thought it worked well. And I always want to close on be respectful of people's time. So I totally get it. And plus, you've got
perfect.
a little guy with you, so time to go.
Henry jumped on here, and this is what we're doing it for, right? So
all right. Bye, guys. Ben, I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye.